November 11th, 1995 started as a fairly ordinary Saturday for Carolyn Killaby, a woman who had a long history of marital troubles. The 34-year-old medical technician from Vancouver, Washington, had been in a 2-day argument with her husband Dan over his drinking, putting a serious strain on their marriage. By that morning, though, they'd patched things up and made plans for a romantic dinner together, the kind of gesture couples use to reset after a rough patch. Dan went off to work, but when his brother called him as he was finishing his shift and invited him for drinks, he made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He and his brother drank late into the night, and at around 1 that morning, he called home and left a message saying he wasn't coming back that evening. Carolyn, left alone with a canceled dinner and a husband who'd chosen a bar over their reconciliation, did what a lot of people might do and left the house. She drove to Omar's Steakhouse and Lounge on Northeast 4th Plain Road in the Orchards area, but despite being a steakhouse, Omar's wasn't exactly upscale. The place had earned itself the local nickname of Snowmars due to its reputation for coke. It was, in spite of or because of this, a popular spot, busy on weekends, and Carolyn sat alone at a table, visibly upset. Multiple witnesses observed her crying at points, dancing occasionally, and drinking heavily over the course of the evening. By the time the night was ending, witnesses noted that she was extremely intoxicated. What happened next has been the subject to significant debate, but what is clear is that she never made it home. Among the people in Omar's that night was a man named Dennis Smith. He'd been watching Carolyn throughout the evening. At some point before the bar closed, he reportedly commented to the bouncer that she was going to find herself in trouble before the night was out. It was a remark that would later take on a deeply sinister meaning. Around 11:30 that night, Smith approached Carolyn. A witness described him essentially steering her toward the exit, with her apparently too intoxicated to fully understand what was happening. The two left the bar together, and that was the last time anyone ever saw her. What happened next is murky, and Smith's account never quite added up. He told investigators he'd been helping a very drunk Carolyn to her car when an unknown man appeared, confronted them aggressively, and then left with her. Smith claimed he drove away and had nothing more to do with it, and nobody ever identified this mystery stranger. Nobody ever corroborated the story, and just before midnight, 2 separate individuals called 911 to report hearing a woman screaming for help near the area. The calls were logged, but given that this was a rough area and this wasn't unusual, nothing was done about them that night. When Dan Killaby came home the next morning and found Carolyn absent, he didn't immediately panic. He assumed at first that she was punishing him for not coming home, staying somewhere else to make a point. But when she failed to show up for her job the following morning, something completely out of character, the alarm bells started ringing. He and his brother began driving around Vancouver looking for her. On November 13th, Dan found her 1991 Toyota Camry sitting in the parking lot at Omar's. Inside, there was a handwritten note about wanting to fly from Portland to Los Angeles. Investigators in the family couldn't fully explain this note, but didn't treat it as evidence she'd simply left on her own. Dan stated unequivocally that it wasn't like Carolyn to vanish without telling anyone. Her family backed him up. Friends confirmed she didn't have a habit of heavy drinking, and the circumstances felt wrong. But it wasn't until the investigation took shape that the full picture of who Dennis Smith really was began to emerge, and it was deeply alarming to say the least. Smith's criminal history stretched back into his youth, and these weren't your typical crimes associated with wayward young adults. And trust me, I'm putting it mildly. His most serious conviction involved the 1982 slaying of his own sister, Patricia Johnson. He'd served roughly 10 years of a life sentence before being paroled in 1993, and the parole board itself had documented concerns. In 1992, the board wrote that it was evident Smith absolutely couldn't consume alcohol or drugs without posing a clear risk to public safety. And yet, by the time of Carolyn's disappearance, he'd been discharged from drug monitoring after 6 months of clean tests. He was, on paper, supervised. However, records later revealed he'd committed at least 25 parole violations that authorities had failed to properly act on. His wife had even sent a letter to the Department of Corrections warning that he was a dangerous psychopath, but it went unheeded. As it turns out, it was Carolyn's case that brought Smith to public attention in a new way, and the public became acutely aware of the monster in their midst. Patricia's son, Dustin, who was 5 years old when his mother was slain by his own uncle, had been living with his grandparents in the same household as Smith. When Dustin read about Carolyn's disappearance in the newspaper and saw that a man named Dennis had been seen with her, he put it together immediately. He called Dan Killaby and shared his suspicion. Dan passed the information to detectives, and investigators confirmed that the Dennis in question was indeed Dennis Smith. And no, you don't have to replay that to make sure you heard that correctly. Dustin was forced to live with the man who had killed his own mother. Smith maintained his story about the mysterious stranger in the parking lot, and later claimed he'd had consensual contact with Carolyn earlier that evening. He claimed that would explain any biological evidence linking them, but detectives didn't buy it. When they searched his truck, they found the passenger seat's cover had been removed, along with the upholstery and carpeting. A large burned hole had been made in the seat, which Smith attributed to a cigarette. While nothing was adding up, at that stage, they didn't have enough to hold him, so they released him and kept investigating. Within 2 weeks of Carolyn's disappearance, Smith vanished. He fled the state and remained a fugitive for over a year. In the meantime, forensic work continued and DNA analysis of blood traces found in Smith's truck matched Carolyn's profile. That evidence, combined with the broader investigation, was finally enough to clap this sick puppy in cuffs. In July 1996, Smith was charged with her slaying, yet he was still nowhere to be found. Then, on January 31st, 1997, a fugitive segment about Smith aired on Unsolved Mysteries. Astonishingly, Smith reportedly watched the episode with friends. Days later, on February 4th, 1997, he was pulled over by police in Florida while driving a stolen vehicle. When he went for the officer's gun during the stop, he was shot and critically wounded. He survived, recovered, and was extradited back to Washington to stand trial. The trial was contentious, and Smith's defense team pushed back hard on the DNA evidence, arguing the blood was consistent with a consensual encounter rather than violence. They also attempted to point the jury toward Dan Killaby as an alternative suspect, citing the couple's marital tensions. They pointed out that the couple were routinely fighting about Dan's drinking habits, and on the night in question, he went out boozing. The jury wasn't convinced and convicted Smith, accepting the prosecution's claim that he had slain Carolyn after abducting her that night. Since he was on probation, any serious offense such as this was the equivalent of a life sentence regardless, so this monster simply eliminated her. Combined with a 99-year sentence that was reinstated for the crime against his sister, he was sentenced to life with no possibility of parole. In 2002, the state of Washington settled a wrongful death lawsuit brought by Carolyn's family for $2.8 million. The state acknowledged that Smith had been inadequately supervised while on parole, despite documented red flags. The settlement was a form of accountability, but it wasn't the closure the family was searching for, and Carolyn's body had never been found. Perhaps since he had exhausted all his appeals, Smith eventually admitted to the crimes against Carolyn. In June 2004, he attempted to lead authorities to her remains, claiming she was buried out on Larch Mountain. But a search was conducted, and nothing was found. And then, just a few months later, Dennis Smith decided to pull the curtains on his life of violence. He was found dead in his prison cell in November 2004, taking whatever he knew about Carolyn's final resting place to the grave with him. So probably much like you, I can't get past the infuriating reality of this case and why this man was ever released in the first place. We're not talking about some petty offender who made a bad decision in his younger years. Dennis Smith strangled his own sister. This may come as a shock to the parole board that released him, but that's not a gray area crime. They documented that he couldn't drink or use drugs without posing a clear threat to public safety, and yet he was paroled anyway. Then he racks up at least 25 violations, and nothing meaningful happens regardless of this. His own wife even warns authorities that he's a dangerous psychopath, and it's ignored. The warning signs were everywhere, flashing red, and still the system failed to act. Carolyn Killaby didn't just disappear because of one disturbed predator that no one could have predicted would strike. She vanished because a system signed off on him, looked at his history, saw the risk, and chose to gamble on the release of an ultra-high-risk offender. Hood River, Oregon, sits about 60 miles east of Portland in the Columbia River Gorge. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where orchard families have worked the same land for generations, and where serious crime is almost unheard of. But in the summer of 2001, this quiet community was shaken by an event that would expose bizarre investigative decisions and tangled personal relationships. The victim was Eric Tamiyasu, a 41-year-old third-generation fruit farmer whose family roots in the area stretched back nearly a century. His death wasn't just a tragedy for the people who knew him. It was the beginning of a mystery that Hood River has never been able to solve. The Tamiyasu family's story in America began in 1906, when Eric's grandfather Gunichi left his farming family in Japan and boarded a ship bound for San Francisco. He eventually made his way to Oregon, laying railroad track before falling in love with the Hood River Valley. He leased land and started growing fruit, and within a few years he had a successful farming operation. Then came 1942, and the Tamiyasu family, like so many Japanese-American families on the West Coast, was forcibly relocated to an internment camp. When they returned after the conflict was over, they found their orchards overgrown, their equipment stolen, and every window in their home smashed. Despite all of that, the family rebuilt and persevered. By the time Eric took over operations decades later, the Tamiyasu orchard was again a well-established fruit-growing business. Eric had recently built a new home right next to the orchard, a place he'd constructed with his own hands. He was single, well-liked, and by all accounts living a peaceful life with no known enemies. On the evening of June 25, 2001, Eric invited his longtime friend Diana Anderson over to his house. The two had been close for years, but had recently developed romantic feelings for each other, and this was essentially their first official date. According to Diana's later recollections, the evening took an unsettling turn. While they were together at the house, they heard someone tapping on the windows. The doorbell rang twice, and both times, when Eric went to check, no one was there. He reportedly heard footsteps running down the driveway, but couldn't see anyone in the darkness. A single shoe print was found in the dirt near the front door. Diana left a few hours later, shaken but safe. It was the last time anyone is known to have seen Eric Tamiyasu alive. Over the following days, Eric went completely silent. He didn't answer his phone or show up to handle business. Friends began reaching out to one another, asking if anyone had heard from him. After roughly 5 days of silence, Don Dixon, a man who described himself as one of Eric's closest friends and his business consultant, drove out to the remote property. Using a spare key he said Eric had given him, Dixon entered the house, and the smell, the deep stench of decay, hit him immediately. Upstairs, he found Eric's badly decomposed body lying on the bed, and he immediately called the police. When Hood River County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they found no signs of forced entry, no indication of robbery, and no obvious evidence of violence on the body. The advanced decomposition had obscured any visible wounds, and investigators initially believed Eric had died of natural causes, perhaps a sudden cardiac arrest. Then came a truly bizarre decision that would haunt this case for decades. After Eric's body was removed, County Sheriff Joe Wampler asked Dixon to help burn the soiled mattress and bedding. Wampler's stated reasoning was that he wanted to spare the Tamiyasu family the grief of encountering the aftermath of decomposition. Dixon complied, and nothing remained of the mattress but the steel frame. That same day, the Oregon State Medical Examiner completed the autopsy and made a shocking discovery, determining that Eric hadn't died of natural causes at all. He'd been shot 3 times in the back of the head while he slept. The bullets had been lodged inside his skull, and the decomposition had completely hidden the entry wounds. This strange and chilling decision to burn the mattress cast a long shadow over the entire investigation and over Sheriff Wampler himself. The investigation identified 3 persons of interest, with the first, of course, being Sheriff Wampler, who had ordered key evidence destroyed. Beyond the questionable decision to destroy the bed, rumors circulated that Eric had been involved with Wampler's wife. Don Dixon claimed that shortly before his death, Eric told him he was dating a Polynesian woman, a description matching the sheriff's wife. However, he didn't know any further details about this woman beyond her ethnic background. If true, this would have given Wampler a personal motive. Wampler denied the affair, denied any involvement, and passed a polygraph administered by his own department. The second suspect was Eric Smith, one of Tamiyasu's closest friends and a business partner. Dixon claimed he'd overheard a heated argument between the 2 men in the days before the attack, alleging Tamiyasu accused Smith of theft from the business. Dixon made the claim that Smith had taken over $50,000, a number that would prove to be highly suspect. Smith, for his part, denied the argument ever happened and said neither man owed the other money. Investigators found that each had invested only around $10,000, calling into question the $50,000 figure. The third and most controversial suspect was Dixon himself. Several things raised red flags. Eric Smith and others disputed Dixon's claim of being a close friend, with Smith saying Eric had described Dixon as merely someone he bought farm supplies from. More troubling was a phone call Dixon made to Eric's sister Ramona shortly after finding the body. Dixon reportedly told her he hadn't found any exit wounds, a deeply strange remark given that the wounds hadn't been discovered yet. Dixon explained he'd assumed that Eric did it to himself, but no weapon was found at the scene and he would have known that. When it came time for polygraph tests, Dixon initially refused. He later agreed, but examiners couldn't establish a reliable baseline, and the test couldn't proceed. Despite national exposure and a private investigation funded by the Tamiyasu family, the case has never been resolved. The authorities eventually considered Diana Anderson's former boyfriend and examined theories tied to the suspicious activity reported the night Eric was slain. However, since all the critical evidence was lost early on, detectives had little ability to fully examine this line of thought. Unfortunately, given that destruction of evidence, it appears likely to me that getting a conviction in Eric's death will likely be virtually impossible regardless. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy dropping in quickly with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and share this video with your friends and family members. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to support my channel further. Bermuda's waters have claimed hundreds of ships over the centuries, so much so that the popular myth of the Bermuda Triangle still surrounds the region. The island sits in the Atlantic, surrounded by shallow coral reefs that have torn apart vessels since the earliest days of European exploration. It's a graveyard, and the remains of those ships have sat on the ocean floor for hundreds of years, waiting for someone curious enough to go looking. In 1955, that someone was a 30-year-old Bermudan diver named Edward Tucker, known to everyone as Teddy. Tucker wasn't some weekend hobbyist. He'd been obsessed with the ocean since childhood, growing up close to Hamilton Harbor. He'd worked at the Bermuda Aquarium as a boy, served as an underwater demolitions expert for the Royal Navy, and returned home to build a life around the sea. By the mid-1950s, he was one of the most experienced divers on the island, regularly exploring the wrecks that littered the reef platform. On a September day in 1955, Tucker was diving at a site he believed to be the wreck of the San Pedro, a Spanish galleon thought to have gone down in the 1590s. He'd already pulled up coins, gold bars, and various other treasures over several dives. Then, roughly 30 feet below the surface, Tucker lifted a heavy plank of wood and found something extraordinary lying face down in the sand. It was a cross, and when he turned it over, 7 large green emeralds caught the light. The piece was made of 22-karat gold, measured about 3 inches by 1.5 inches. It featured tiny gold nails hanging from rings on its arms, likely representing the nails of the crucifixion. The emeralds were cut in a style dating back to the Middle Ages, and the craftsmanship, while beautiful, appeared to be the work of New World artisans rather than jewelers from Spain. The cross also had a removable back, concealing a small, empty cavity, presumably once used to house a sacred relic. It was, at the time, considered one of the most valuable single objects ever recovered from a shipwreck. Tucker's discovery didn't just make him a world-famous treasure hunter. It also created an ownership dispute with the Bermudan government, which argued that the territorial seabed belonged to the British Crown. Tucker reportedly told them that if that was the case, he'd take everything back to the reef and let them search for it themselves. The government relented, and Tucker retained ownership. Despite this, Tucker wasn't interested in selling to the highest bidder. Numerous individuals and institutions put in unsolicited bids, and at one point the American ambassador to Italy sent a representative to Bermuda. That agent had simple instructions that few people could turn down: acquire the cross at any cost. Despite being told to name his price, Tucker refused to consider the offer, believing that the cross was the equivalent of the crown jewels of Bermuda. He eventually agreed to sell the entire haul from the San Pedro site to the Bermudan government for roughly £35,000. This was a fraction of the value of the cross alone, and Tucker simply wanted the money to fund further searches. The government placed the cross on public display in an aquarium of all places, where it remained safely stored for years. In February 1975, Queen Elizabeth was scheduled to visit Bermuda to survey the island. As part of the royal visit, the San Pedro treasure collection was to be transferred from the aquarium to the newly established Bermuda Maritime Museum. There it would be displayed for the Queen's inspection, and Tucker was invited to serve as a guide for the presentation. The treasures were packed up and transported to the new location, and several people handled the items as the display was arranged. Everything seemed to be in order. Then, just moments before the Queen arrived, Tucker took one last look at the display. Something about the cross bothered him. It didn't have the same weight or the same presence he so clearly remembered, so he reached out and touched it, and gold-colored paint came off on his hand. The Tucker cross had been replaced with a cheap replica, and the paint wasn't even dry. Tucker was stunned, but there was no time to raise an alarm. He quickly removed the fake and rearranged the remaining treasures. He composed himself just in time to present the collection to the Queen, as though nothing had happened. The visit went smoothly, but behind the scenes, a crisis was unfolding. The police investigation that followed revealed just how vulnerable the cross had been. The key to the safe housing the cross at the aquarium had been kept in an unlocked cabinet. The fact that the paint on the replica was still wet when Tucker discovered the switch suggested the swap had occurred in the preceding couple of days. Detectives believed it likely occurred during transit between the aquarium and the Maritime Museum. The window of opportunity was narrow but apparently sufficient. Bermuda's police force wasn't used to this sort of crime, and they called in reinforcements. The FBI, Scotland Yard, and Interpol all became involved in the investigation. Despite this international cooperation, there was almost nothing to go on. Multiple people had access to the cross during the transfer, and nobody involved admitted to knowing that a replica had been substituted. The investigation produced no arrests, no reliable leads, and no recovery of the original cross. Several theories emerged over the years, with most suspecting an inside job, though no evidence supported that claim. Others believed that the sophistication of the crime pointed to something more international, specifically the creation and use of a convincing replica rather than simply stealing the cross outright, suggested to many that the thief was likely a professional. Tucker himself believed that someone had been hired to take the cross, given the planning involved in fabricating a decoy, though he never named who he thought was responsible publicly. The Tucker cross has never been recovered, and the case remains officially unsolved more than 50 years later. What makes it even more painful is that the cross wasn't the only treasure to go missing from Bermuda's museums. In 2005, visitors to the Bermuda Maritime Museum noticed that several other items from Tucker's collection were missing from their display cases, including a gold bar and a gold chain. As with the cross, these items were never recovered either, pointing to ongoing systemic security failures on the island. On the morning of December 10, 1968, on the western outskirts of Tokyo in Fuchu, a single individual pulled off what many consider to be the most audacious robbery in Japanese history. Without firing a shot, without injuring a soul, and without ever being identified, one person managed to steal nearly 300 million yen from 4 bank employees. Adjusted for inflation, that haul would be worth somewhere in the range of $9 to $10 million today. It's the kind of crime that sounds like it belongs in a movie, and in fact, it's been turned into several. However, despite the apparently non-violent nature of this crime, it would, as I'll explain, eventually claim the lives of 4 people. But before the decades of obsession came the crime itself, and to understand how it happened, you need to understand the Japan of the late 1960s. Japan was in the thick of its economic miracle. Companies were booming, factories were running at full capacity, and workers were being rewarded handsomely for their efforts. Twice a year, Japanese companies distributed bonuses to their employees, a tradition stretching back to the Edo period. The winter bonus, typically paid in December, was an especially significant one. For Toshiba's factory workers in Fuchu, that bonus amounted to roughly 294 million yen. On this particular December morning, 4 employees of the Nippon Trust Bank were tasked with delivering that cash by car to the Toshiba plant. The money sat in 3 metal cases in the trunk of a black Nissan sedan. It was a routine delivery in a cash-heavy economy where bank transfers weren't yet the norm for large corporate payroll distributions. What made this robbery possible wasn't just the thief's nerve. It was the groundwork that had been laid in the days and months before. Between April and August of 1968, someone had sent 9 threatening letters and extortion demands to the Tama Agricultural Co-op in the same general area. These letters demanded money and threatened bombings and arson. Then, on December 6th, just 4 days before the robbery, a branch manager received an ominous piece of mail. The letter demanded 3 million yen be delivered by a female teller to a specified location by the following afternoon, or the sender would bomb the bank and the manager's home. The bank didn't comply and instead contacted police, who dispatched around 50 undercover officers to stake out the drop-off point. The extortionist never showed, but the damage, in terms of psychological preparation, was done. The bank's employees were now primed to believe that a genuine threat existed. When the Nissan sedan set out on the morning of December 10th carrying the Toshiba bonuses, the staff inside were already on edge. Normally, only 2 employees would have accompanied such a delivery, but the recent threats had prompted the bank to double the escort. Importantly, handwriting analysis later confirmed that the threatening letters sent to the Tama Co-op and the letter sent to the bank manager were written by the same person. The Nissan was only a few hundred feet from its destination when something very unusual happened. A young man on a white police motorcycle, dressed in the uniform of a Tokyo Metropolitan Police officer, pulled alongside and signaled the car to stop. The location was a quiet stretch of road near the walls of Tokyo Fuchu Prison, a comparatively desolate location in the metropolis. The fake officer approached the vehicle and delivered a stunning piece of news that would have normally seemed unbelievable. He told the 4 bank employees that their branch manager's house had just been blown up and that police believed a bomb had been planted beneath their car as well. The employees, already anxious because of the recent threats, didn't question him, and they got out of the vehicle as fast as they could. The imposter then crawled beneath the vehicle, ostensibly to check for explosives. Moments later, smoke and flames erupted from under the car, and the employees, terrified, ran for cover. What they didn't realize was that the smoke came from a simple road flare the thief had ignited to sell the illusion. While they scrambled to safety, the fake officer calmly climbed into the driver's seat of the car and drove away with nearly 300 million yen in the trunk. The entire operation, from the moment the car was flagged down to the moment it vanished down the rain-slicked road, took roughly 3 minutes. With the proper groundwork, that's all it took to pull off the biggest robbery in Japanese history. By the time the bewildered employees gathered their wits and contacted the bank, only to learn that the manager's house was perfectly fine, the thief had already vanished. He'd driven the bank car to a secondary location where he transferred the metal cases to a stolen vehicle, then switched cars again. Multiple getaway vehicles had been arranged in advance, each one stolen beforehand and staged along the escape route. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department declared a state of emergency across the city within minutes. Checkpoints were established at intersections throughout Tokyo, and officers searched every vehicle passing through. Despite this massive and immediate response, the thief slipped through the net entirely. By the end of the day, police had to concede that their dragnet had failed. What followed was the largest criminal investigation Japan had ever seen at that point, with tens of thousands of police officers from Tokyo and across the country participating in the search. Roughly 100,000 forensic sketches were printed and distributed across the country, with the image achieving the cultural equivalence of the Unabomber sketch. The suspect list eventually ballooned to an astonishing 110,000 names. Fingerprints collected from the crime scene, the abandoned vehicles, and other evidence were painstakingly compared against 6 million prints on file, but not a single match was found. The serial numbers of every stolen banknote had been recorded, and authorities monitored banks and businesses across the nation for any sign of the money entering circulation. Despite this massive effort, Curiously, none of the money ever ended up surfacing. The investigation also produced over 120 individual pieces of physical evidence recovered from the various crime scenes. This included the motorcycle that had been painted white to resemble a police vehicle, a hat, the road flare, and a magnet. Most of these items were common, simply everyday objects, and it's widely believed the thief scattered them deliberately to muddy the investigative waters. The weather that morning had also been rainy, which further hampered evidence collection and limited the reliability of witness accounts. The investigation produced several prominent suspects, though none was ever charged. The first and seemingly most compelling was a 19-year-old man known publicly only as Boy S. He was the son of a motorcycle police officer and a member of the Tachikawa Group, a local youth motorcycle gang. His familiarity with police uniforms, motorcycles, and the local area made him an obvious person of interest. He had no alibi for the morning of December 10th. Despite a publication ban on his name, both him and his father became temporarily notorious in police circles. Unfortunately, just 5 days after the robbery, on December 15th, he was found dead of potassium cyanide poisoning. Authorities ruled that he did it himself, but in a twist, they declared that he was innocent, with absolutely no evidence to connect him to the crime. Tragically, it appears that the significant attention that was placed upon him and his father had driven him to commit this act. Sadly, though, this wouldn't be the only tragedy connected to a false accusation in this case. A year later, in December 1969, the Mainichi Shimbun newspaper publicly identified a 26-year-old man as a suspect. Police arrested him on an unrelated charge as a pretext to interrogate him about the robbery. It turned out he had an airtight alibi since he'd been sitting a proctored examination at the time of the heist. The arresting officer was subsequently charged in relation to this bad faith arrest, accused of putting closing the case above getting to the truth. Disturbingly, the suspect's life was destroyed. His reputation was shattered. His family went bankrupt defending him, and he eventually chose to end it all over the accusation. Notably, 2 police officers involved in the investigation took the same route during the course of the investigation, also having their reputations ruined for failing to solve the case. Then, in November 1975, just weeks before the criminal statute of limitations was set to expire, a friend of the original teenage suspect was arrested on an unrelated charge. He was found carrying a large sum of money. He'd been 18 at the time of the robbery. Police pressed him for an explanation of where the cash had come from, but he refused to speak. Without proof tying his money to the stolen funds, and since it didn't match the serial numbers, they couldn't charge him and had to let him go. Some believe that this individual was, in some way, involved in the original heist, and that he may have been the fake cop himself. In December 1975, exactly 7 years after the crime, the statute of limitations for criminal prosecution expired. The police officially acknowledged that no charges would ever be brought. In a bizarre twist, the investigation had cost an estimated 900 million yen, roughly 3 times the amount that had been stolen in the first place. Then, in 1988, the civil statute of limitations also lapsed, meaning that the perpetrator could now come forward and tell the entire story without facing any legal consequences whatsoever. The fact that the thief has remained silent even after all legal risk evaporated has fueled endless speculation. Some theorists believe the perpetrator died before he could enjoy the money, and that he was perhaps even Boy S himself, despite the police ruling him out. Others have suggested the robbery was the work of a small, organized group, possibly connected to the leftist student movements of the 1960s. Still others believe the sophistication of the operation means that it may have been the work of one of the Yakuza organized crime families. Under this theory, the money never resurfaced because the heat associated with the crime was much greater than expected. Some have even theorized that the individual responsible may have been silenced permanently by this organization to prevent the details of the crime from ever coming out. Potentially more far-fetched ideas claim that it may have been an intelligence operation by North Korean agents, eager to get their hands on Japanese currency for foreign operations. Under this theory, North Korean agents may have used this money while abroad, posing as Japanese citizens. However, given that none of the stolen money ever re-entered Japan despite over half a century passing, this seems increasingly unlikely. There's a critical detail about this case that often gets overlooked. The robbery was, in a practical sense, victimless, even if the investigation itself wasn't. Nobody was physically harmed during the heist, and the Toshiba employees received their bonuses on time because the money was fully insured. The insurance company's own losses were covered through international reinsurance, meaning the financial impact barely registered domestically. But that hasn't stopped the case from becoming one of the most famous crimes in Japanese history. The robbery has inspired novels, manga, films, and television specials, with the earliest film version coming out in 1975. Notably, the crime has become embedded in Japanese popular culture, in much the same way that the D.B. Cooper hijacking has captivated the American imagination. And it makes sense because the parallels between the two cases are striking in many ways. Both involved lone perpetrators conducting extremely daring crimes for significant amounts of money, as well as a total absence of any meaningful resolution.